Have you ever played a game like Dungeons and Dragons before? Or any role playing game? If the answer is no, this video is for you. But chances are you already have all the skills you need to play that game. Stay tuned. Hello, everybody. I'm Don Franco 3, the Busy Person's GM. Welcome to RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. Today, we're going to be talking about how you don't need any previous experience to play Dungeons and Dragons or any other type of role playing game. Because chances are you've already acquired the skills throughout your life to play those kinds of games. I hear a lot of times that Dungeons and Dragons is a very complicated game. And sure, sort of it is. I mean, every game has rules, so there's always something to learn, and there's always a learning curve in the very beginning. But the very basic core mechanics of the game are very simple, and you as the player, much simpler for you to start playing the game. So, I want to talk about those previous skills you may have acquired. Have you ever played that game, What Would You Do? You know that game, like, what would you do if that person showed up? What would you do if this happened? And then you typically respond with, I would do this, I would do that. And whoever was playing this game with you would sometimes give you what would happen afterward. You've probably acquired another skill that's very important for role playing games as well, and that's chance. How many times have you taken a quarter and flipped it to try to determine what you're going to do? Many times. Am I going to go left? Am I going to go right? Cheeseburgers, tacos, those kinds of things. In Dungeons and Dragons and other RPGs, they combine those two aspects, the what would you do scenario and the game of chance. But instead of flipping a coin, they use 20-sided dice. The reason they do this is because maybe you're better than a 50-50 chance to succeed at something. So therefore, what they've done is they've divided those chances into 20 bits to really refine how good you would be at doing certain things. Okay, now let's take a quick scenario. How do you play Dungeons and Dragons or any RPG? Now imagine you and your friends are in a cabin in the woods, and I asked you, what would you do if you heard a screaming out in the woods? What would you do? That's how the game of Dungeons and Dragons is played. Let's just say you decide that you want to go out to the front porch and see what is going on. I then make you make a roll on that 20-sided dice to try to determine, do you see something lurking behind the woods? Now, let's say you do. Then what? That's when your character sheet comes into play. Now, most of us have something like this, a resume, right? A list of skills that we have, profile about ourselves, our strengths, our education, and maybe other things we like to do that we might be interested in. What about Dungeons and Dragons? In Dungeons and Dragons, use this, a character sheet. And very similar to a resume, it lists all the things that you're good at. But now, things such as your strength, how fast you are, as well as all the skills that you have, reading magic, being athletic, knowing acrobatics, all these things are important in Dungeons and Dragons. And essentially, this character sheet becomes your reference sheet. So most of the time when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you're only going to really be focusing on your ability scores, some of the skills you might use while you're playing, as well as some of the weapons you might be using. In addition, you'll be looking at things such as armor class, because that determines how good you can avoid being hit. Your speed, because you need to know how fast can I run from that monster behind a cabin. And hit points, which essentially determines how much life points you have, how many blows you can take from a monster. So the next thing you might be asking yourself, okay, I have this reference sheet. There's something lurking behind the woods, but how is it exactly I know what I can do on my turn? Like when I'm playing, what can I do? In Dungeons and Dragons, there's only 3 to 4 really basic things you need to know. You can either take an action, a bonus action, which sometimes is kind of more of like a minor action, and move. And sometimes When a monster is doing something or under certain conditions, you can do a reaction. You react to something that's happening. And that's it. Three different things you need to know on your turn, plus potentially a reaction that you could do. And on that action, most of the time, all you do is attack. And in some cases, you might want to do a dash action. And all that is you run twice as fast to get the hell out of wherever you are. Maybe you want to get away from that Sasquatch or whatever's lurking behind those trees. Now, when it comes to magic, it's a little more complicated. In our world, the real world, there is no magic, unless you're talking about that special magic. But in Dungeons and Dragons, there is magic. So, how does that work? A lot of people say it's complicated. There's a lot of different pages for it. But if you take a closer look, it's actually not that hard. Here, I'm going to show you very quickly how easy running magic is. Now, it's easy in the sense that there's not that much to it. You do have to pay attention to those fine details. But that is why sometimes they recommend that the most experienced players play the wizards or the sorcerers because they do take a little more tender love and care to make sure you play the character right. Let's take a quick look. If you look at this slide, there's really only a few things you need to know about every single spell in the book. There's lots of spells, and that's going to be the complicated process, trying to determine what kind of spells you want to use. But let's take a quick look over here. What I've put here are three examples of spells that utilize all the basic components of the actions that we just talked about. So right here, we're looking at casting time, which tells you how much of your actions or what kind of action do you need to cast the spell. For Fireball, it's one action. The range is 150 feet. Components, that's verbal, somatic, and material. We'll talk about that here in a second. For Shield, it costs you one bonus action to use. The range is 60 feet. And again, this VSM. And what I also want to point out, the Fireball is instantaneous, which means you immediately cast it and it goes off. For Shield of Faith, the duration is up to 10 minutes. And if you look at Hellish Rebuke here in the middle, it has a casting time of one reaction, which we mentioned earlier. The range is still 60 feet. There's verbal, somatic components, and it's instantaneous. Now, verbal, you need to be able to chant some words. Somatic, gestures. We've seen them in all the movies, hand motions and waving in the screen. And material components. In some cases, we've seen movies where they grab something out of a pouch or they cut off a chicken's leg and then they use that as a component for the spell. And that's it. You have to know all your spells. You have to go through the list, choose the ones that you want to have for your character, but you also have to be able to understand and how to use them. And that's kind of where it becomes a little more tricky. There's a little more moving parts there. And that's pretty much it, everybody. Dungeons and Dragons is a game of chance, but instead of using a coin to flip 50-50, you get a d20 so you can increase your chances to have a better outcome. In addition, it's just a game of what would you do? We've played this game before. What would you do if this happened? What would you do if that happened? The Player's Handbook is the only book you need to play Dungeons and Dragons. There's a lot of things in there. However, as a character, you only really need to understand a few things. Now, for the Dungeon Master, it's a little more complicated. Not only do you have to understand all the things that player characters can do, which again, it's not a lot of things. There's an action, bonus action, move, and sometimes you get to do a reaction. If you're a magician or a spellcaster of some kind, you need to understand, are these magic spells actions, bonus actions, or reactions? And you need to understand that text of what those spells actually can do. As a dungeon master, you don't necessarily need to know how the spells work. It's really up to the players to understand that. It is your responsibility to look over those spells and make sure they're using them correctly. But for the dungeon master, there's also these things called cheat sheets. Let me show you here. On this sheet, they list how difficult things are, how easy they are to do, as well as various types of actions that you can do during your turn. Using this cheat sheet, you're able to play the game as the dungeon master. And all you do is create the what would you do scenarios for all your players. And that's pretty much it. That's Dungeons and Dragons in a nutshell. And this video is intended for level 0 players, level 0 dungeon masters. I hope it was useful. I'm Don Franco 3, and here in RPG Boons, we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notifications, and I'll see you next time.